Good morning. I'm Ellison Barber in for Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers right now on Morning News Now. Lasting legacy tributes pouring in this morning for former Secretary of State Colin Powell, the barrier-breaking soldier and statesman whose death yesterday from COVID-19 complications impacted many from across the political spectrum.
One of our great military leaders and a man of overwhelming decency.
The world lost one of the greatest leaders that we have ever witnessed.
A look back at his military and political career, plus new questions about his health and the factors that may have led up to his death. Shot clock. The FDA set to recommend an extra dose of the COVID vaccine as soon as tomorrow, and that includes the mix and match approach. We'll talk to a doctor about what that could mean for you and your family. Kidnap for ransom. The Wall Street Journal now saying the gang behind the abduction of 17 missionaries in Haiti is demanding $1 million each for their safe return. We'll have the latest on the investigation there in Port-au-Prince and here in the U.S. And you're not alone. So many Americans are struggling with their mental health, so we're introducing a new weekly segment right here on Morning News Now, focused on some of the biggest challenges in self-care and what you can do about it. Such an important conversation, and we are so happy to have you with us this morning.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Good to see you. We begin this morning, of course, with former Secretary of State Colin Powell, who died yesterday due to COVID-19 complications. He was 84 years old.
Yeah, and White House flags were lowered to half staff as leaders across the political spectrum mourned the former diplomat and four-star general. President Biden leading the tributes during a speech yesterday.
He's not only a dear friend and a patriot, one of our great military leaders and a man of overwhelming decency. This is the guy born son of immigrants in New York City, raised in Harlem in the South Bronx, graduated from City College in New York. And he rose to the highest ranks not only in the military, but also in areas of foreign policy and statecraft.
NBC News global security reporter Dan DeLuce joins us now with more on this. Good morning, Dan. So the president was one of many paying tribute to General Powell yesterday. Who else have we heard from?
That's right. We heard from so many former officials who served with General Powell. We heard from former Presidents Bush and Clinton, and we also heard from the Vice President and the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. Let's hear what they had to say.
He broke so many barriers, and those barriers were not easy to break by any stretch. But he did it with dignity. He did it with grace. And because of what he was able to accomplish, it really did elevate our nation in so many ways. So may he rest in peace.
Colin Powell dedicated his extraordinary life to public service because he never stopped believing in America. And we believe in America in no small part because it helped produce someone like Colin Powell. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
So there you hear what they had to say, and I think what Secretary of State Blinken said, I think many other people echoed this idea that, in a way, Colin Powell represented really America at its best. Someone who could rise from humble origins to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary of State. And of course, he did blaze a trail. He was the first African-American to be National Security Advisor, to be the top military officer, to be the Secretary of State. And he was considered to be a contender for the presidency in the 90s, to the point where the Democrats were quite concerned before the 96 election. Of course, he chose not to pursue the Republican nomination. He's also someone, I think, who is a throwback and a reminder to a different time when the country was a little less divided and the Republican Party was less ideological. And it was also a time when the U.S. was a bit more powerful and had fewer challenges, for example, from China now.
Yeah, I mean, there is no doubt he is someone who broke major barriers. What do you think his greatest legacy will be?
You know, I think it's maybe two parts to that. One is this fact that he was the first African-American to serve in those roles and to really be the first African-American who was seen as a serious contender for the White House. So in a way, he kind of led the way to Barack Obama's moment. And then I think he'll be remembered as a humble, kind of reserved public figure who was not, it was not about bluster. It was not about vitriol. He was sort of a voice of restraint and tolerance. And I think that is also part of his legacy. Now, of course, the Iraq War is also part of his career, too.
Yeah, I was going to say, we really can't talk about him without talking about that, the Iraq War. That was arguably a low point in his career. He was front and center trying to gain international support for the invasion. He gave a UN speech that was later found to be based on false intelligence. How did that moment impact his career? And does it, that speech in particular, does it tarnish his legacy?
I think he definitely saw it as a blemish. He called it a blot. And what he stands apart, what's interesting is that really no other major figure involved in that Iraq war has really expressed many regrets, if any. And he has been willing to acknowledge that that was something to regret, that he was basically asked to give a speech that was based on some false information. And for someone who had really an unblemished track record, I think it was painful for him, and he did acknowledge that. But of course, the war was going to happen with or without that speech. And the Bush administration at that time had made up its mind they were going to invade Iraq, so we shouldn't put too much on it. But it is interesting. It's also a story of his humility, where he was willing to say, I'm not perfect, and that was a mistake, and he regretted it.
All right, Dan, thank you so much for that.
Let's dig a little deeper into Powell's legacy with NBC News political analyst Jonathan Alter. He's also a presidential historian and a columnist for the Daily Beast. Jonathan, great to have you with us. Thank you so much. So let's pick up on this trailblazer idea. I mean, Powell was the first Black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and first Black Secretary of State. First, I want to play a little bit of sound. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, the first Black man to hold that position. Here's what he just said yesterday about Powell.
The world lost one of the greatest leaders that we have ever witnessed. And I lost a tremendous personal friend and mentor. He has been my mentor for a number of years. He always made time for me, and I could always go to him with tough issues. He always had great counsel. We will certainly miss him. I feel as if I have a hole in my heart.
What do you think this says about Powell's impact on the leaders that came after him? And what do we know about the role he played as really a mentor to others?
This is a huge part of Colin Powell's legacy. The armed forces in the United States are the greatest vehicle for upward mobility that we've had in this society over the last 75 to 100 years. The military has been open to advancement by African Americans and other minorities in ways that many other institutions have not. Colin Powell rose the highest, but he wasn't one of those officers who just was looking for the next promotion and not really interested in those who came behind him. And Secretary Austin is just one of many examples of African Americans who owe their careers really to Colin Powell's example, and in many cases to his specific help for them. So it's easy to forget how hard it is to be the first, and with what grace he assumed, in breaking those barriers. It becomes less difficult for those behind him because he set an example. And I think Secretary Austin makes an extraordinarily important point, not just in talking about his own close relationship with Colin Powell, but in describing all the other people that he inspired, Black and white, and all sorts of people, because Colin Powell was not into identity politics. He wasn't into politics at all, which is the reason he decided not to run for president in 1996, even though he very well might have been elected. I don't see anybody who would have stood in his way for the Republican nomination, which was eventually won by Bob Dole. I don't think Dole or Lamar Alexander or Steve Forbes or the other Republicans who ran that year could have beaten him in those primaries, and which were coming up just a couple of months after he made his decision not to run. And then he was about 15 points ahead of incumbent President Clinton in the polls. Would he have beaten Clinton? We don't know for sure, but I think the likelihood is considerable that he would have. So all of this just indicates that this was a figure beyond politics, of a stature that really is an inspiration, not just for others in the military and government, but in all areas of life.
Absolutely. I think one of the other things, especially when you put it in context with where it feels like we're at a lot of times right now in this country, is that Colin Powell was famously not tied down by party. He served under both President Bush's, but then endorsed President Obama in 2008. What do you think our current divisive political landscape can take away from his legacy?
That it's important to put country ahead of party. And, he became a Republican in 1996. Before that, he was like Eisenhower had been when he was in the military, which is there's no place for party identity when you're on active duty. And then after he left active duty, he felt initially more comfortable with the Republican Party for some years, but then felt that party had gone so far off the rails that he ended up, after January 6th, he resigned. He left the Republican Party very explicitly early this year, but it had been more than 10 years since he could really be identified as a Republican, and he spoke at the Democratic Convention. He felt so strongly that Donald Trump was, as he described it, a liar and a threat to our country, that he threw in his lot with the Democrats, and he endorsed not just not just Hillary Clinton. I think people know that he came out for Barack Obama against his friend John McCain in 2008, but he endorsed Hillary Clinton, and then this last time he gave a very strong endorsement for Joe Biden. He was very, very concerned about Donald Trump and his effect on the country, and he felt that the party that he had called home for a long time basically had gone in a direction that he felt was quite dangerous for the United States.
Jonathan Alter, your analysis, your expertise is so appreciated on a morning like this. Thank you so much for helping us remember General Colin Powell. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, Savannah.
Let's bring in now senior scholar at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, Dr. Amisha Dalja. Dr. Dalja, I think we can say for both of us, we have a lot of news that we could use your insight on. So if we can, let's start with what we've been talking about, the passing of former Secretary of State Colin Powell, because a lot of people heard he was fully vaccinated, but they might not have known, that he also had other serious health conditions when he died, a cancer that weakens white blood cells as well as Parkinson's disease. How would those illnesses impact the effectiveness of the vaccines?
Well, General Powell was not only did he have multiple myeloma and Parkinson's disease, but was also 84 years old. And what that does is decreases your ability not only to fight off the virus or respond to the vaccine with the ordinary doses, but also decreases what's known as physiological reserve, that you don't have much to actually deal with the virus if you do get ill. And all of that really compounds together. And in somebody with those conditions, it's very likely that if they get a breakthrough infection, it's going to not be one of the mild ones. That's why we've recommended boosters for that group. And my understanding is General Powell had not had his booster because he became ill before his booster was scheduled, before he had a chance to get it. But all of that really underscores the fact that there is still a risk for people that have high-risk conditions, even when they're fully vaccinated. And the best way to protect them is to get more people vaccinated so case counts come down and they're less likely to encounter the virus.
Let's now stay on this idea of boosters. I know people have a lot of questions about this. So the FDA is reportedly expected to approve this idea of mixing and matching COVID vaccine boosters. So meaning you're going to get a different type of booster than the first, or maybe just your first or your first and second doses potentially. So walk us through what exactly this means. And there's already confusion surrounding boosters. What do you think this is going to mean for people who hear, okay, I might be able to get one of those mRNA ones, even if I got Johnson & Johnson the first time? And what kind of impact do you think this could have in the fight to stop the spread of the virus?
So when it comes to mixing and matching, this is something that had been known for a while, that if you mix vaccines that use different technologies, you might get a stronger boost, be more robustly immune to whatever you're fighting against. And they've done this with bird flu vaccines. And we saw this early on with AstraZeneca in the UK, that if you got one type of vaccine using a certain type of technology and then got boosted by an mRNA vaccine, by the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine, you got a bigger boost than would be expected. So what the FDA has seen is data with people who got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine getting boosted with Moderna, a different technology vaccine, having a really robust response. So that may be a way to improve vaccines, improve the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and it may make its way into other vaccines. So right now, the FDA is kind of weighing that data, and you might see a recommendation that if you've gotten the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it's okay to go get a Moderna vaccine, and it may actually protect you better. Obviously, this is going to be confusing because there's so much mixed messaging about boosters. So it's going to really need a good public health campaign to explain this. And doctors are going to have to talk to their patients about what vaccine may be the best for them. But when it comes to the trajectory of the pandemic, it's important to remember we talk a lot about boosters, but the most important thing are first and second doses. Those are the people that are getting hospitalized. Boosters protect people who are already vaccinated, who usually are not the ones that are going to be taking up hospital beds or dying. It's really people that don't have any immunity. That's who we really still need to focus on getting vaccinated.
All right, Dr. Adalja, thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. Let's turn now to Haiti, where FBI agents and State Department officials have been sent to help free a group of 17 missionaries kidnapped by a violent gang. The Haitian Justice Minister told the Wall Street Journal that the gang is asking for a $17 million ransom, $1 million each. NBC News has reached out for confirmation. Let's bring in NBC News correspondent Sam Brock, who's in Miami, for more on this. Hi, Sam. Good morning. What do we know today?
Savannah, good morning. In addition to that massive figure, reportedly $17 million, the Justice Minister from Haiti also saying this situation could take weeks to resolve. This as we learn more information about the reported ages of the children who are being held hostage.
Overnight, a major request for ransom. The Wall Street Journal, citing Haiti's Justice Minister, reporting the gang responsible for the kidnappings wants $1 million per person. That's $17 million total. The Justice Minister also telling the Journal that the 5 children kidnapped include an 8-month-old baby, and the other kids were 3, 6, 14, and 15 years old. The FBI and State Department have both dispatched teams to Haiti, with White House officials keeping any potential plans to free the 17 people, nearly all Americans, under wraps.
The president has been briefed and is receiving regular updates. Due to operational considerations, we're not going to go into too much detail.
The kidnapping by a notorious gang, putting a sharper focus on Haiti, a country ravaged by extreme poverty, political instability, and natural disasters. Protesters in Miami calling on the U.S. to stop deporting Haitians. The U.S. has pledged money and training for Haitian police forces, though by one study, kidnappings have jumped 300% in 3 months. Dr. Richard Frechette, who runs a hospital in Port-au-Prince, telling us by phone he has to negotiate with gangs to get oxygen for COVID patients inside.
Sometimes we have real hair-raising days facing shortages. You can imagine if we have 65 patients, 40 will be dead in an hour the minute we don't have oxygen. That's how bad they are.
From priests and police to school children, no one in the country is off limits.
Every single day, they kidnap at least 20 to 25 people in Haiti.
Every single day?
Every single day. They kidnap you. Your family doesn't have no money. What they do, they kill you.
Hey, we have reached out to the Office of Haiti's Justice Minister, Savannah. So far, I've not been able to independently confirm that information. But he did tell the Wall Street Journal that he is deeply concerned any ransom money would go for more guns and more ammunition to these gangs. Savannah, back to you.
All right, Sam Brock with some heartbreaking details there. Thank you so much.
On Capitol Hill, the clash between former President Trump and the congressional committee investigating the January 6th insurrection is heating up. The former president is now suing to try and stop the National Archives from handing over documents related to the attack. This comes as the committee prepares to vote to recommend a former top Trump advisor be held in criminal contempt. NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalas is here to help us break it all down. Danny, let's start with the former president's lawsuit. This was filed yesterday. What exactly is he claiming here?
The president procedurally has to sue not the Biden administration, but the National Archive. And that's because the Presidential Records Act takes all of those records, that's logs, all the information from Trump's White House era, and transfers them to the National Archive. So Trump correctly is suing the National Archives because they are the caretaker of the information. But now that he is no longer the president, his power to prevent disclosure of those records diminishes significantly, and he has to seek that injunction. And the Biden administration does have some say, arguably a greater say than the former president, in deciding whether or not those documents and records are ultimately released.
So executive privilege seems to be key. You said there that it diminishes, but I guess not necessarily disappears. Explain to us how that usually works when a president is no longer in office. Have any past presidents been able to retroactively protect documents?
So Trump has basically two arguments in the privilege front. One is attorney-client privilege, and the other is executive privilege. And a series of cases from back in the 70s called Nixon 1 and Nixon 2, and you can guess which president that involved, dealt with, or at least announced the existence of executive privilege. In other words, we know what it is, we know it exists, but we don't really know the contours of it, even today. And there have been cases along the way that have chipped out or defined or clarified further what executive privilege is, but not in every single situation. So Trump, the other Nixon case, Nixon 2, tells us that Trump, as an ex-president, has the power to assert executive privilege, but to what degree is still undefined. And arguably, President Biden has the ability to veto it, in a sense, to trump it, pun intended, pun not intended, Trump's own claim of executive privilege.
Okay, so let's talk about someone else involved or tied to all of this, Steve Bannon, former Trump advisor. He is in the crosshairs, if you will, of the January 6th committee. What can you tell us about the votes scheduled for later today and the legal jeopardy that Bannon is facing?
From the outset, Congress signaled that this situation, subpoenaing folks like Bannon and other former Trump orbit folks, would be different. We're going to issue subpoenas right away. We're getting these documents. But as time rolls on, it's really like it is almost every other time Congress has sought to subpoena documents from the unwilling, whether the witnesses themselves don't want to produce it, or in this case, President Trump ostensibly is refusing to let Steve Bannon disclose that information. The challenge is that Congress clearly has this broad authority to issue subpoenas and gather information. But when the rubber hits the road, Congress doesn't appear to have the actual power to enforce those subpoenas. Yes, it has a sergeant of arms that can send out and arrest these people, but that's not a practical or really reasonable way to get the information. So as is normally the case, this starts out with a lot of fanfare, ends with a lot of negotiation.
All right. Well, we will keep an eye on the fanfare and the negotiations. Danny Cevallos, thank you so much for that.
Now to the fight over abortion rights, the Justice Department is once again asking the Supreme Court to block the Texas law that bans most abortions. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams breaks down the latest development here.
This is the second challenge of the Texas law to reach the Supreme Court on an emergency appeal. The court turned away the first one. It was brought by abortion providers in Texas. But the Justice Department says this lawsuit raises much different issues and is stronger. The court turned away the first appeal in early September by a 5-4 vote, saying that it presented what the majority called complex and novel questions about whether the court had the authority to hear it, given the unusual structure of SB 8 as the law is known. In this latest challenge, the Biden administration says Texas cannot take away the right of access to abortion without providing a means to defend the right in court. Unlike every other abortion restriction to come before the Supreme Court, SB 8 does not depend on state officials to enforce it. Instead, anybody can file a private lawsuit against an abortion provider and seek at least $10,000. The law has stopped nearly all abortions in the state, forcing women seeking treatment to travel elsewhere. The Justice Department says the state has essentially nullified the Supreme Court's past decisions on abortion rights and that the state has no legal power to do that. A federal judge in Texas blocked enforcement of the law in early October, but a federal appeals court put a hold on his ruling, and that allowed SB 8 to go back into effect, and that's what the Justice Department is now appealing. The issue of whether the Constitution provides a right to abortion at all will be squarely before the Supreme Court in a different case in December. The justice will hear a challenge to Mississippi's law that would ban abortion after 15 weeks. That case presents a direct challenge to the court's abortion precedents, including Roe v. Wade, which say states can't ban abortion before fetal viability. The issue in this latest case is the structure of the Texas law, whether the federal government has the legal authority to challenge it and whether the federal courts have the jurisdiction to hear the challenge. The court is signaling its intent to move quickly with this new challenge. It's ordering Texas to file a response by noon on Thursday. Savannah, Ellison?
All right, Pete Williams, thank you so much. And now it is time to get a check on your morning news now weather.
Bill Cairns, good morning. What's going on?
Well,
Good
look
news,
behind
bad
me.
news.
We're going to talk a lot about. Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about this as we go throughout the next couple of days, maybe the next couple of weeks, hopefully maybe even the entire winter. We're going to talk about California and their rain chances because their rainy season is beginning right now. And they keep their calendar a little different than the rest of us. They have their what they call their calendar water year. It starts when the rainy season begins and then it ends when the next rainy season begins. So they just finished up the one from this last year, and they're saying it was the driest since 1924. About 50% of average rainfall throughout the state. So the drought just got that much worse. Again, this was the second driest in a 125-year record. So that's all the bad news. But let's look forward. Let's fill our glass back up. Okay, so we showed you how bad California is and the extreme drought throughout it. But now we are starting our water year lining up the storms. We had one little storm that's now going through the Rockies. We got another big storm that's just off the coast, and there's one behind it. So they're lining up. We're going to see a series of storms. We're going to get about 3 of them. So one comes in late tonight. It'll be with us during the day on Wednesday. Then it looks like another pretty good-sized storm comes in Thursday night into Friday. And then one comes in over the weekend. We don't want to ruin your weekend plans, but we want to fill up these reservoirs. We want to build up the snowpack at the higher elevations. So this is all good news. And the rainfall forecast over the next 7 days even gets down maybe to Los Angeles. And notice the heavier amounts in the Sierra, up to 5 inches of rain at least widespread. West-facing slopes could get 10 inches of rain in the next 7 days. So this is all fantastic news for the West, who will take every raindrop they can get. The rest of the country looking pretty mild and warm for the middle of the nation to the east, and even the Northeast after a chilly morning is looking for a sunny, beautiful afternoon. I am full of good news today.
Yeah, wow. Yay, Bill.
We love it.
Rain where we need it and calm everywhere else. That is a very good report from you. Thanks so much. We'll see you next hour.
Okay.
And coming up, while the U.S. struggles with a supply chain crisis, it's been quite the opposite for China.
This is a story not just about Chinese activity, but about American inactivity.
Up next, the latest in our series, Behind the Wall. We'll take you to one port where it's been smooth sailing for Chinese companies and how it's impacting the race for global dominance with the U.S. This is Morning News Now.
Welcome back. As part of our special series covering China this week, as you just saw, Behind the Wall, NBC News is examining the global footprint of Chinese companies, something Washington is watching.
Yeah, NBC News senior correspondent Keir Simmons takes us to Greece, where an ancient port is now a symbol of a very modern race for global dominance between the United States and China.
With the supply chain crisis putting a spotlight on ports around the world, China's outsized role in the global economy is front and center. We are in Greece, where a Chinese state-owned shipping company, COSCO, owns a majority of this port, and business is booming. The port across Athens there is as ancient as the city itself. We weren't allowed to film at the port. COSCO didn't respond to our request for an interview, so we took to the sea. A Chinese COSCO ship is waiting to dock. Another is unloading. This port is one of many major infrastructure projects carried out by Chinese companies, always with the backing of Beijing. China's growing footprint here, a good thing to some.
Piraeus today is the fastest growing port of the world, thanks to the volume and the management of COSCO.
But these Greek dock workers disagree.
COSCO has a greediness to increase profitability, And this is affecting our income, is affecting our rights, is affecting our safety.
The Chinese have gained a Greek port, but they don't have Greek hearts.
Yes.
Chinese companies have spent billions of dollars on ports like Piraeus in Peru, Djibouti, Sri Lanka, Pakistan and Israel, according to data compiled by conservative think tank AEI. And now Beijing is considering pouring state money into a major port in Iran.
This is all about increasing global connectivity such that China is at the center of worldwide trade, financial, and technology networks. Xi Jinping's vision is for a China-centric Eastern Hemisphere at the least, and possibly for Chinese preeminence worldwide.
Experts say the US is offering no real competition for China when it comes to these ports worldwide.
This is a story not just about Chinese activity, but about American inactivity.
But today, China's global investments are under increasing scrutiny. Some, like the port in Greece, are lucrative and seem strategically smart.
What Piraeus gives them is an entryway into Europe.
But experts say many look like they could be bad business deals, with China facing economic problems of its own. Today's international shipping crisis will test China's global strategy, as well as the world economy. Keir Simmons, NBC News, Athens, Greece.
Keir Simmons, thank you so much for that report. Now let's look at what is making news around the world this morning.
Ali Arouzi joins us today from London. Hey, Ali, good morning.
Good morning, Savannah. Well, in their latest flurry of provocative missile tests, North Korea has fired a submarine-launched ballistic missile into waters off the coast of Japan, according to the South Korean army. They unveiled the missile in January, and at the time, they said it was the most powerful weapon on Earth. The test also comes at a time when South Korea is hosting a major arms affair, is holding a meeting of spy chiefs who are discussing North Korea's nuclear program and preparing for a space launch. Authorities in Portugal have seized 5 tons of cocaine worth an estimated $232 million. 183 bales of the drug were discovered on board a yacht in the Atlantic. Authorities there say it's the biggest drug bust in Europe in recent years. And finally, in the name of climate change, Greta Thunberg rickrolled at Climate Live, a climate action concert for the youth. There was a captivated audience watching her sing and dance to Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up. And those are your headlines.
I mean, I love a good rickroll. Have you ever rickrolled anyone?
No, but we just did a story about this recently, so it's like stuck in my head from Joe and I laughing about it.
Yeah. Your time is now.
I know.
That was a big hit.
Yeah.
That was a big hit when I was 13. Now it's a meme that I don't understand.
Oh, you can get it.
Ali, thank you so much. All right, and coming up, from burnout at work to pressure on social media, so many of us are really dealing with mental health challenges right now.
Absolutely, and up next, we'll be joined by a licensed therapist to break down what's going on and, most importantly, how to cope. You're watching Morning News Now.
As the fallout over the new Dave Chappelle special continues, some of Netflix top talent showing their support for a walkout among employees who identify as trans. Jonathan Van Ness, Angelica Ross, and Colton Haynes are just a few stars filming a PSA that will be presented alongside the walkout and a list of requests by employees who identify as trans at Netflix. The walkout is being called a, quote, stand up in solidarity. And it comes after Netflix co-CEO Ted Sorensen defended comedian Dave Chappelle's latest special, The Closer. It's been slammed for transphobic and homophobic content. Several Netflix employees were suspended after they interrupted a meeting with executives to voice their concerns. The walkout and rally scheduled for tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. will support those workers and all employees who identify as trans at Netflix.
Right. There's been a lot of back and forth on this, and we will keep on watching what happens after that walkout. Thanks, Ellison. We're now entering a second day of jury selection in the murder trial of 3 white men accused of killing Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old black man who was shot last year while out for a jog. The shooting was filmed by one of the men accused in his murder. NBC News correspondent Katie Beck shows us what we can expect in the days ahead.
Many have waited to see this day in court, the start of the Ahmaud Arbery trial. The courthouse just a short distance from where 25-year-old Arbery was shot and killed. His family says while jogging in a residential neighborhood.
I'm very, very thankful that I reached this stage in the case where we're going to pick a jury and possibly put these men behind bars forever.
Jury selection could take up to 2 weeks, the court summoning a total of 1,000 people in the small rural community, casting a wide net to ensure the case that sparked national outrage can seat 12 impartial jurors and 4 alternates. 3 men are charged with Arbery's murder, father and son Greg and Travis McMichael, who armed themselves and pursued Arbery, and William Roddy Bryan, a neighbor who joined the chase and recorded cell phone video of the incident. The McMichaels have said they thought Arbery was a burglar, responsible for a string of recent thefts in their area, while Bryan has argued he was just a witness. In a statement, Bryan's defense attorney, Kevin Goff, telling NBC News, Roddy Bryan looks forward to jury selection, the trial of his case, and to returning home afterwards to his family. Attorney for Arbery's father, Ben Crump, feels optimistic about the case.
The video is the most important witness in this entire case.
A case underway, a story now returning to the national spotlight as a final chapter begins. Katie Beck, NBC News, Brunswick, Georgia.
All right, Katie Beck, thank you so much for that report. And jury selection in the trial is set to resume later this morning. We'll stay on that.
Art Acevedo, one of the nation's most outspoken advocates for police reform, has been fired after just 6 months on the job. It comes as more and more top cops nationwide are leaving their post. The former Miami police chief is speaking exclusively with NBC News correspondent Gabe Gutierrez.
Savannah and Allison, good morning. This was Art Acevedo's first interview since being fired by the Miami City Commission late last week. He had built a national profile advocating for police reform. But then things took a turn, and he calls this an embarrassment. Miami's mayor once called him the Michael Jordan of police chiefs, but Art Acevedo is out of a job after city commissioners fired him just 6 months into his tenure.
Pretty embarrassing episode in a 35-year career.
Is there any further claims he was fighting corruption and punished for sending a memo accusing city commissioners of interfering with investigations. But his critics say Acevedo lost the trust of the rank and file, used offensive language at a protest, threatened suspension of unvaccinated officers, and said the force was run by the Cuban mafia.
Do you regret saying that? Yes, because it was used for political gain by some. But also, I do believe that members of the exile community, some of them, I'm part of that exile community, that it was hurtful to them.
Acevedo had become a national advocate for police reform after leading departments in California, Austin, and Houston. But he also drew intense criticism there after a botched drug raid.
Let me list a couple of adjectives that people have used to describe you. Outspoken. Yes. Brash. Can be, yes. Grandstander. I would say that use the bully pulpit that these positions bring, yes. What is your biggest regret during your tenure here in Miami? Not doing my homework before agreeing to come here.
He hopes to continue his career in public service, growing emotional when asked about his father.
I'm not a quitter. My mom and dad didn't come here for us to be quitters, and I don't plan on quitting.
Acevedo becomes the 40th big city police chief to depart over the last 2 years. Unusually high turnover among top cops nationwide. Savannah Nelson.
Gabe Gutierrez, thanks for that.
We now want to bring you a new series we're launching on Morning News Now, focusing on some of the biggest mental health headlines of the week. We'll bring in experts that will give us insight into these headlines and how they impact you and what you can do to make sure your mental health is in the best shape it can be. Let's bring in Dr. George James for more on this. Dr. James is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and you probably recognize him as a friend of this show. Dr. James, it's always great to have you. Thank you so much for being here with us. This is such an important one, and I'm excited to kick off this series. So let's start with work burnout. I think something a lot of people can understand, especially with how it's just felt the last year and a half, maybe at home while working and trying to do whatever your family needs for you. We've seen hundreds of companies commit to improving the mental health of employees since the start of the pandemic, but employees are still actually reporting a 21% increase in burnout. There, you can see that on your screen. What are these companies doing wrong? Are they doing something wrong? And what can we do to protect our mental health when it comes to work?
Good morning, Savannah. It's great to be here. And yes, I think a lot of companies are trying to help their employees. I think it's something that I wish that was happening a little bit earlier. Being able to say that your mental health is important, but also not just saying it's important, but involving that in the day-to-day, right? What does it mean to take time off? What does it mean to take breaks? What does it mean to figure out what deadlines really need to happen versus what deadlines can wait? And some of this is the pressure between deliverables and making sure that we're the company's a success while also protecting the most valuable asset, which is their employees. So I think companies can continue to do more and employees can take the opportunities that are given to them.
Absolutely. Now I want to turn to one that's a little scary. This is somewhat frightening. Now it's split here in terms of doctors thinking exactly what is the cause of this, potentially related to social media. We obviously are learning some frightening impacts about social media, what it can do to our mental health, especially young people. But here's this information here. Doctors are seeing an increase in teen girls presenting with facial tics and abnormal body movements. Now, some doctors think watching TikTok could be causing these facial tics. Specifically, there's watching Tourette syndrome videos online has become something that a lot of parents might not know about. But also, other doctors believe stress and anxiety could be leading to these tics. Do stress and anxiety physically manifest themselves, and how can parents help their kids? What's your big concern here?
As you shared, we've been in a pandemic for over a year and a half, right? Which means that a lot of people have been home, a lot of people have been on screens, especially for our teens. They've been forced to have to deal with things, being bored by just being on social media and doing all these things. What I would encourage a lot of parents to do is to stay connected to your child and what they are posting, what they're watching, what they're doing, right? There could be increased stress, more feeling like they're being left out or other things, and being connected to them and then helping to talk to them can be helpful. That can also help to possibly reduce some of the anxiety and depression. In addition, pay attention to any changes in behavior and mood. Usually that's connected. I mean, teenagers, that's just part of what happens, but sometimes behavior and mood can also link to anxiety and depression and other things. And if you can have early conversations, that might allow them to shift and not get into an extreme place.
Absolutely. Really, really, really good advice there, doctor. Now let's stay on social media and actually something that actor Jonah Hill posted. He's calling on fans to stop commenting on his body. In an Instagram post, he said, quote, "I know you mean well, but I kindly ask that you not comment on my body, good or bad. I want to politely let you know it's not helpful and doesn't feel good. Much respect." How do comments like these, and as he pointed out, they're good or bad, impact our self-esteem or make us think, maybe something is more important than it really should be, or we have this skewed view, especially with what young girls are served up on Instagram constantly. But I think it's really important also to hear from a male actor stepping up here and mentioning this. Is there a way that we can protect ourselves without deleting social media altogether? And what do you think the importance of someone like him coming forward and saying that this affects his mental health is?
Yeah, part of this is, I think it is great, right? Being able to say that these comments, good or bad, do impact people. It makes people hypersensitive to their bodies and to really to the part of if they're okay. And what the goal is to get to the place of to try to reduce the negative self-talk that we have, that I'm not good enough, I'm not the right size, I'm not wearing the right thing. And then from there, being able to, if possible, to limit how much you pay attention to the negative comments. Because the more you feed yourself the negative comments, the more that becomes the negative self-talk, which then impacts your self-esteem. And overall, I think the heart of what Jonah Hill is saying, which a lot of people are saying, is that to remember you are enough. That the good comments or the bad comments is really trying to make you feel like you're not enough, that you're not okay. But the more you can tell yourself that and believe that, you can be okay with your body, you can be okay with your looks, you can be okay with all the different parts of who you are.
Oh, absolutely. What an amazing message there. Another good tip I've heard is make sure you know what you're following. Don't follow a bunch of accounts that make you feel bad about yourself or that are obviously edited images. Keep it positive. Be consuming that more positive information if you are going to spend time in those spaces. Dr. George James, thank you so much. Thank you for helping us kick off this really important segment. It's always great to have you.
Thanks for having me. Have a good one.
And coming up, more and more students going home hungry.
Yeah, after the break, another consequence of the supply chain shortage, plus the added challenge in getting kids fed. This is Morning News Now. Welcome back. Supply chain issues are hitting school cafeterias hard across the country, and it's happening at the same time millions of students are lining up for breakfast, lunch, and even dinner this school year. NBC News senior business correspondent Stephanie Ruhle takes us inside this growing issue.
For school districts across the country, serving lunch is becoming a tall order.
It has never been like this. So this is really, truly a 100-year event.
We are out of a few items today.
Supply chain issues and price hikes are impacting everything from vegetables to utensils in lunchrooms, including Jefferson County, Kentucky.
It's not just produce, it's not just supplies, it's across all, and it's coming multiple times a day, multiple times a week sometimes.
According to a recent survey of 1,400 school nutrition directors, nearly all are concerned about supply chain issues, and 90% worry about staffing shortages. Schools are reliant on government funding to break even on meals. Last year alone, they served 330 million lunches per month. Lunchrooms face the additional challenge of meeting USDA nutritional guidelines to get that vital funding while staying on budget.
Our supply chains in many areas have been disrupted. Schools really do have to plan their meals in advance.
And experts hope there's an end in sight for logistics snags and child hunger.
Schools, once they find those creative ways, they will be able to offer more students the meals that they need to increase food security.
Cooking up solutions for a new school year. Stephanie Ruhle, NBC News.
An important story, Stephanie. Thank you for that report. And as school lunches become more disrupted from stressed supply chains, the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced a $1.5 billion investment last month to provide more assistance to schools so they can feed their students. And coming up, from near death to saying I do right inside the hospital.
Yeah, up next, we'll introduce you to one man who got COVID twice and decided he was not waiting any longer to marry the love of his life. Stay with us. This is Morning News Now.
A battle with COVID-19 wasn't going to stop a Michigan man from marrying the woman of his dreams.
Yeah, the couple was able to tie the knot at the hospital this past weekend. They got help from hospital staff in the form of a flower girl and also a ring bearer. Have a look.
Mr. and Mrs. Keel.
This is a moment that almost didn't happen. COVID-19 sent Devlin Kuehl knocking on death's door.
Well, I've had it twice now, and you just don't know. And each time it seems to get a little worse. I've been on a ventilator. I've been where I'm just out of my mind. I mean, not knowing where I was at. I didn't recognize anybody. It was miserable.
Devlin says he did not get vaccinated because he'd already had COVID-19. He thought he could wait a few months before rolling up his sleeve, but he tested positive again and wound up in the ICU at Sparrow Hospital.
Did you ever have a moment where you thought you might not make it through this?
Oh, I had many days where I didn't think I would make it through it.
Now COVID-free, but still on the mend, Devlin was able to leave his hospital room to marry the love of his life inside the hospital that saved his. And this isn't about regret. This is about cherishing life.
Do what you want to do. Don't wait.
Right.
Don't wait. Because we've been waiting, and because we thought we'd want to have a big wedding, and we wanted to make sure everybody would be a part of it. But, you know, obviously, every time we tried to plan things didn't go the way we wanted them to. So it's just important that we're together, and that's it.
Right. Well, I get to marry my love. And hopefully I'll get a chance to go home, and we got a nice new house, and we can enjoy that together.
To Mr. and Mrs. Kuehl, and a life full of happiness. And Savannah, he told me he has now been vaccinated. He says he wishes he'd done it sooner, but now he's just happy to get home soon. He thinks he's going to be discharged this week and will start his new life with his wife.
With his wife. Oh, congrats to them. What an amazing, good news to come out of a hospital at a time like this. Great story. Thank you.
That does it for us this hour of Morning News Now.
But the news continues right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.